On the morning of the 6th of September, 1781, a British general stood on the Connecticut shore and watched an American port burn. Warehouses, ships, homes, churches, more than 140 buildings going up in smoke and flame, an entire town consuming itself. He knew this place. He had been born 13 miles up the river. He had grown up in this country, sailed these waters, walked these streets. Some of the men dying across the river that day were people he had once called neighbors and countrymen. 6 years earlier, this same man had marched 1,000 soldiers through a frozen wilderness, half of them dying, to try to conquer Canada for the American cause. He had bled for that cause at Saratoga in the fighting that turned the whole war. There had been a time when he was, by a fair argument, the finest battlefield general the United States possessed. Now, he wore a British uniform, and he had come home to burn his own state. His name was Benedict Arnold, and this is the story of the day the most infamous traitor in American history led an enemy army against the country of his birth. Welcome to our video on the raid on New London. To understand the horror of what happened at New London, you have to understand what Benedict Arnold had once been, because the tragedy is not that a villain did a villainous thing. It is that one of the great heroes of the Revolution became its greatest traitor. In the first years of the war, there was no more aggressive or capable soldier in the American cause than Benedict Arnold. In 1775, he helped seize the guns of Fort Ticonderoga. That same year, in one of the most astonishing feats of the entire war, he led an army through hundreds of miles of trackless Maine wilderness in early winter to attack Quebec. A march so brutal that his men ate their own shoes and boiled leather to survive, and half of them died or turned back before reaching the walls. Arnold was shot in the leg leading the assault, and in 1777 at Saratoga, the pivotal victory that brought France into the war and changed everything, it was Arnold's reckless courage on the battlefield that arguably did more than any other man's to win the day. He was wounded again, in the same leg, leading the charge. By any measure, Benedict Arnold was a genuine hero of the Revolution, admired, brilliant, and brave to the point of madness. Washington valued him enormously. His soldiers followed him anywhere. He should have gone down in history beside the greatest names of the founding. Instead, his name became a synonym for betrayal, because somewhere between Saratoga and New London, the finest fighting general America had turned against everything he had bled for and offered his sword, and a great deal more, to the king. How that happened is one of the most studied psychological collapses in American history. And to understand the man standing on that Connecticut shore watching a town burn, we have to understand why he came to be standing there at all. Arnold's betrayal was not a single decision, but a long, bitter accumulation of grievances, real and imagined, that ate away at a proud and thin-skinned man until nothing held. He felt, and often with justice, that he was never given his due. Junior officers were promoted over him. Congress was slow to recognize his achievements and slow to reimburse the money he had spent out of his own pocket in the service. He was a brilliant soldier and a poor politician, and in an army where advancement required cultivating friends in Congress, his talent for making enemies cost him again and again. The resentment festered. Then came money and marriage. Arnold lived beyond his means, ran up debts, and while serving as military commander of Philadelphia, became entangled in questionable financial dealings that led to accusations, a court-martial, and an official reprimand, even though the reprimand, delivered by Washington himself, was mild. To Arnold's wounded pride, it was intolerable. He had bled for this country, and this was his reward: suspicion and rebuke. Around the same time, he married Peggy Shippen, a young woman from a family with loyalist sympathies, who is widely believed to have encouraged and helped facilitate what came next. What came next was treason of the highest order. By 1780, Arnold had secured command of West Point, the fortress that controlled the Hudson River, the single most important strategic position in the American North. And he secretly agreed to hand it over to the British, along with its garrison, for money and a British command. The plot was exposed almost by accident when the British officer carrying the details, Major John Andre, was captured with the incriminating papers hidden in his boot. Andre was hanged as a spy. Arnold, warned just in time, fled down the Hudson to a British warship and escaped. He had tried to sell the most vital fortress in America to the enemy. Now he was a British brigadier general, reviled by the country he had betrayed. And to earn his new master's trust and his blood money, he would have to fight his former countrymen, which he now did, with a cold and terrible energy. By the late summer of 1781, the whole war was rushing toward its climax, though few yet knew it. Far to the south, Lord Cornwallis had marched his army onto a Virginia peninsula and begun fortifying a small tobacco port called Yorktown. And George Washington, seeing his chance, had turned his combined American and French armies south in a forced march to trap him there, while a French fleet moved to seal off the sea. The British commander in New York, Sir Henry Clinton, could see something large developing, and he wanted to disrupt it. He needed a diversion, something to alarm the Americans in the north, to pull Washington's attention and perhaps his troops back away from the march south. And he had, in Benedict Arnold, both an eager instrument and an obvious target for that instrument to strike. Arnold suggested, and Clinton approved, a raid on the Connecticut coast, specifically on the port of New London. There were solid military reasons for the choice. New London was one of the most successful privateering bases in America. Its privateers, privately owned armed ships licensed to prey on enemy commerce, had captured an enormous number of British merchant vessels, hundreds of them, costing British trade a fortune and filling New London's warehouses with captured goods. Burning that nest of raiders would punish the privateers, destroy their prizes, and strike a real economic blow. But there was another reason Arnold was the perfect man for this particular job, and it was a darker one. Because no British officer alive knew New London and its defenses better than Benedict Arnold. He had grown up right next to it. He was coming home. On the 2nd of September, 1781, Arnold received his orders. Within days, he would lead some 1,700 British, Loyalist and Hessian troops against the harbor he had known since boyhood. Benedict Arnold was born in Norwich, Connecticut, a town at the head of the Thames River, only about 13 miles up the water from New London. This was his country in the deepest sense. As a young man before the war, he had been a merchant and a ship's captain sailing out of these very waters, trading up and down this coast. He knew the river, the harbor, the towns on both its banks. He knew where the forts were and how strong they were. He knew the people. There is no way to soften what this means. When Benedict Arnold sailed into the mouth of the Thames on the 6th of September, he was not a foreign general attacking a strange enemy town. He was a Connecticut man leading a foreign army against his own homeland, against a community bound to him by a lifetime of ties, some of whose defenders he very likely knew by name. One of the militia families across the river, the Ledyards, had relatives scattered through the region Arnold had grown up in. It is this fact that gives the raid its peculiar, lasting horror, and it is why Connecticut has never forgotten or forgiven it. The monument that still stands at the site names him plainly, in stone, as the traitor Benedict Arnold. Not merely the enemy, the traitor. Because to burn the towns of a country that is not your own is war. To lead an enemy army in the burning of the country that raised you 13 miles from the house where you were born is something for which the ordinary language of warfare has no adequate word. That morning, the wind briefly favored the defenders. It turned against Arnold's fleet and delayed his approach, costing him the pre-dawn surprise he had wanted and giving New London a few precious hours of warning. But it was not nearly enough. By 9 in the morning, the traitor was ashore in his home country. Arnold's plan was to strike both banks of the Thames at once. The river divided the target. The town of New London stood on the western shore, and the town of Groton, guarded by the formidable Fort Griswold, stood on the eastern shore, directly across the water. Whoever held Fort Griswold on its commanding height controlled the harbor, so Arnold split his force. He personally led roughly half his men, around 800 Norse ashore on the New London side, to destroy the town, the warehouses, and the shipping. The other half, roughly 800 more, he sent across to land on the Groton side under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Edmund Eyre, with orders to take Fort Griswold. The defenders were pitifully few. The whole harbor was under the command of a 43-year-old militia officer, Colonel William Ledyard, and he simply did not have the men to hold everything. When the alarm came, he made his choice. He would concentrate what force he could on the strong point, Fort Griswold, and try to hold it until reinforcements arrived from the surrounding towns. That alarm, tragically, was muddled at the very start. Fort Griswold fired the signal guns to warn the countryside that the enemy had come. But a British ship in the fleet fired a third answering shot, and by the local code, 3 guns did not mean invasion. 3 guns meant a friendly privateer was bringing in a captured prize. The confusion delayed the militia turnout across the region, so that the help Ledyard was counting on was slow to gather, and in the end largely never came. On the New London side, Arnold's men pushed inland against only scattered token resistance. They quickly took the lightly held Fort Trumbull, whose tiny garrison spiked its guns, fired a defiant volley, and escaped across the river by boat. The road into New London lay open, and Arnold's men set about their work. Arnold's great prize slipped through his fingers at the outset. The privateers, the ships he had most wanted to destroy, had seen the British coming, and many of them had slipped their moorings and fled up the Thames toward Norwich out of his reach. It was a real disappointment to him, but if the ships had escaped, the town had not. Arnold's men entered New London and put it to the torch. They split into parties and set about burning the town systematically, working to fire it from both ends. The warehouses went first, warehouses stuffed with the goods and provisions of a thriving privateering port, including the cargoes taken from captured British ships, then the wharves and the vessels still at anchor, then the shops, the public buildings, and the homes. And here the fire took on a life of its own. Among the buildings set ablaze was a storehouse packed with gunpowder, and when the flames reached it, it exploded, throwing burning debris across the town and igniting a general conflagration that spread far beyond what even the raiders may have intended. Fanned by the wind, the fire consumed block after block. When it was over, something like 140 buildings lay in ashes: dwellings, stores, warehouses, mechanics' shops, barns, and 9 public buildings including the church, the courthouse, the jail, and the custom house. New London was very nearly leveled. Arnold would later insist that the destruction had exceeded his intentions, that the gunpowder explosion and the wind had carried the fire beyond his control. Perhaps that is even partly true, but it hardly mattered to the people whose homes and livelihoods were gone. He had come to burn their town, and their town had burned. Dozens of families were left homeless as winter approached. Terrible as the destruction of New London was, it was almost entirely a loss of property. Across the river, at the same hour, something far worse was happening: a loss of men. On the Groton side, the attack on Fort Griswold went nothing like New London. Here there would be a real fight, and then an atrocity. Fort Griswold was a strong, star-shaped earthwork on high ground overlooking the river, with walls of considerable height. It was defended by only about 150 to 165 men, militia and local volunteers, many of them farmers, some fighting alongside their own fathers, sons and brothers, gathered to defend their homes. Against them came Eyre's 800 British regulars. Colonel Ledyard knew he was heavily outnumbered, but he expected reinforcements at any moment and judged that the fort's strength might let him hold until they came. So when the British sent forward a flag of truce demanding his surrender, Ledyard refused. The British sent the demand a second time, now with a chilling threat attached. If they were forced to storm the fort, no quarter would be given. The defenders would be put to the sword. Ledyard, by the accounts, answered that he would not give up the fort, come what may. So the British stormed it, and the defenders made them pay a fearful price. As the redcoats struggled up the slope and against the walls, the militia poured musket and cannon fire into them, cutting down attackers by the score. The British commander, Eyre, was gravely wounded. His second-in-command, Major Montgomery, was killed leading the assault, by tradition, run through with a pike as he crested the wall. In the space of a short, savage fight, the little garrison inflicted heavy casualties on the professional troops attacking them, killing and wounding on the order of 200 British soldiers. For roughly 40 minutes, 150 farmers held off 800 regulars and bled them white. But numbers told. The British forced the gate and poured into the fort. Ledyard, seeing the enemy inside his walls and further resistance hopeless, gave the order to surrender. And it was the surrender that became a massacre. What happened inside Fort Griswold after the surrender is the darkest episode of the whole affair, and it must be told carefully because it sits at the meeting point of documented fact and bitter, contested memory. The core is not in doubt. Before the fort fell, the defenders had lost only a handful of men killed. After it fell, after they had surrendered, the great majority of the garrison was killed or wounded. Roughly 85 Americans died that day, and around 60 more were wounded, many mortally, out of a garrison of only about 160. Almost the entire force became casualties, and the overwhelming majority of the killing happened after resistance had effectively ended. The gravestones in the local burying grounds, carved by grieving families, say it plainly: men inhumanely massacred, a 14-year-old boy who fell in the action, widows made by the dozens. Something horrific happened in that fort, and the community that buried its dead never had any doubt about it. At the center of the story is the death of Colonel Ledyard. According to the American accounts, including a report the governor of Connecticut sent to Washington within a week, when Ledyard surrendered, he offered his sword hilt first to a British officer in the traditional gesture of capitulation, and the officer took Ledyard's own sword and ran him through with it, killing him on the spot. Then, the accounts say, the enraged soldiers fell upon the surrendered and wounded defenders with bayonets, killing men who had already given up. Here, honesty requires care. The British accounts of the battle make no mention of any massacre, and the specifics have been disputed for 2 centuries. Whether Ledyard was truly killed with his own surrendered sword or cut down some other way in the chaos is genuinely uncertain. Some later analysis notes that the most influential American eyewitness account was embellished, and its author even altered his story over time. So the precise cinematic image of the sword may be part truth and part legend. But strip the disputed details away, and the terrible fact remains, written in stone in the graveyards: most of the garrison of Fort Griswold was killed after it surrendered. That is not legend, that is a massacre. The cruelty did not end with the killing inside the fort. There is one more image from that day that has never left the local memory. After the fort was taken, the British gathered up the American wounded, those still living among the heaps of the fallen, to move them down off the height. They loaded a number of the bleeding, broken men onto a heavy ammunition cart at the top of the steep hill that ran down toward the river to carry them to the water, and the cart got away from them. On the sharp slope, the heavy wagon, loaded with wounded men, broke loose and rolled and careened down the hillside, gathering speed until it smashed into a tree at the bottom. The men inside, already shot and bayoneted, already suffering, were flung and crushed in the crash, adding a final gratuitous agony to a day already full of it. Whether the cart was deliberately let go or simply slipped its handlers in the chaos is, like so much of that day, disputed. The survivors were carried to a nearby house, that of Ensign Ebenezer Avery, which became a hospital of horrors filled with the dying. Those defenders who could still walk were taken prisoner and carried off to the British ships. Colonel Ledyard was dead. Most of his officers were dead. In one short morning, the little community of Groton had lost a huge portion of its grown men, killed defending a fort that could not be held, most of them after they had laid down their arms. Across the river, the smoke of New London still rose into the September sky. Benedict Arnold's raid was accomplished, and now we must ask what it had actually achieved. Chapter 10. The raid that meant nothing. Approximately 330 words. Here is the final bitter irony of the New London raid. For all the destruction and all the death, it accomplished nothing of what it was meant to accomplish. Recall the entire purpose of the operation. It was a diversion, a blow struck in the north to frighten the Americans, to pull George Washington's attention and perhaps his army away from his march against Cornwallis in Virginia. That was the strategic point of burning New London and storming Fort Griswold. It failed completely. Washington was not diverted. He did not turn back to defend Connecticut. He did not detach troops to chase Arnold. He kept marching south, exactly as he had planned, toward Yorktown. The raid did not delay him by a single day. And 6 weeks later, on the 19th of October, 1781, Lord Cornwallis surrendered his entire army at Yorktown. the catastrophe that effectively ended the war and won American independence. The burning of New London and the massacre at Fort Griswold turned out to be one of the very last significant actions of the war in the North, a pointless spasm of destruction on the eve of the British defeat that made all of it irrelevant. So the ledger of Arnold's raid reads like this. On one side, a leveled town, dozens of families left homeless, roughly 85 dead and 60 wounded Americans, most of them killed after surrender, a whole community gutted of its men. On the other side, nothing. No strategic gain, no effect on the outcome of the war. Even Arnold's own British masters were unimpressed. Clinton thought the casualties his raiding force had suffered, a quarter of its strength, were far too high a price, and Arnold earned criticism rather than the glory he craved. He had burned his own homeland and presided over a massacre for a diversion that diverted no one in a war that was already lost. And then he went home to New York and then to England to live out the rest of his life. After Yorktown ended the war in America, Benedict Arnold's usefulness to the British was finished, and so, in every way that mattered, was his life, though he lived on for another 20 years. He sailed to England with his wife, hoping to be received as a hero of the crown. He was not. The British tolerated him and paid him something of what he had been promised, but they did not respect him. To many British officers, a man who had betrayed his own side was simply not to be trusted, however useful his treason had been. A traitor once is a man who might be a traitor again. He tried his hand at trade and various ventures, drifted, quarreled, and never found the standing or the fortune he believed he was owed. He died in London in 1801, largely scorned on both sides of the Atlantic, unwanted by the country he had betrayed and unloved by the country he had betrayed it for. His name, meanwhile, had already become in America what it remains to this day, the very definition of a traitor. Not merely a man who changed sides, but the archetype of betrayal itself. And New London and Groton became a permanent part of that legend, the place where the traitor's treason turned to fire and blood, and where he did it unforgivably to his own people. The monument the people of Connecticut raised at Fort Griswold, one of the oldest war monuments in the entire country, built before the one at Bunker Hill, does not let the visitor forget who was responsible. It names him in the stone, and it has stood there, naming him for nearly 200 years. So how do we hold the whole of Benedict Arnold in our minds? Because the hardest thing about his story is that both halves are true. The man who burned New London was the same man who marched through the frozen hell of Maine to Quebec, who bled twice at Saratoga in the fighting that saved the Revolution, who was once, by a fair reckoning, the best battlefield general the United States had. And the man who did all of that was the same man who tried to sell West Point to the enemy, who led a foreign army against the state that raised him, and who stood on a Connecticut shore and watched an American town burn 13 miles from the house where he was born. There is no separating them. The hero and the traitor were one person, and that is precisely why his name has haunted America ever since. Not because he was a monster from the start, but because he was a hero who chose to become a monster. New London was where that choice reached its terrible bottom. We hope you found this look at the darkest day of America's most infamous traitor worthwhile. More videos on the American War of Independence are on the way, so make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell so you don't miss them. A like, a comment, and a share help the channel enormously. We'll catch you on the next one.